My name is Frederick Lane, and I'm 72 years old, sitting here in this cramped studio apartment in Kansas City that I was tricked into renting after my own son hired professional actors to pose as social workers, complete with fake badges and official-looking documents, who convinced me that my home was unsafe and that I needed to immediately relocate to a temporary facility for my own protection while they conducted a bogus safety assessment. For 3 months, I lived in this overpriced hovel believing that government officials were helping me, until I discovered that the entire elaborate deception was orchestrated by my son Thomas to force me out of my paid-off house, so he could sell it and pocket the proceeds while I was warehoused in substandard housing. I'd love to know where you're listening from today, so please share your location in the comments below. And if this story resonates with you, I hope you'll consider subscribing, because what happened to me shows how sophisticated scams can target elderly people using their trust in authority figures, and how even our own children can become master manipulators when money is involved. Let me start by telling you about the life I had built before it was stolen from me through an elaborate theatrical performance, so you can understand what it meant to lose not just my home, but my faith in the very institutions designed to protect elderly people like me. I had lived in the same 3-bedroom house on Maple Street for 38 years, a modest but well-maintained home that my late wife Eleanor and I had purchased when Thomas was just 5 years old. Eleanor passed away from cancer 4 years ago, leaving me alone in the house where we had raised Thomas and created decades of happy memories. The house was completely paid off, worth approximately $200,000, and represented my primary asset and source of security in my retirement years. It was more than just property. It was a repository of my life's most precious memories and my only significant financial asset. I had worked for 35 years as a postal supervisor, earning a modest but steady income that allowed Eleanor and me to live comfortably and save for retirement. We had been frugal and responsible with money, paying off our mortgage early and maintaining our home in excellent condition through regular maintenance and careful attention to repairs and improvements. After Eleanor's death, I continued living independently in our family home, managing all household tasks and maintaining the property without assistance. At 72, I was in good health for my age, with only minor issues like arthritis and high blood pressure that didn't significantly impact my ability to live alone and care for myself. Thomas visited regularly and seemed supportive of my decision to remain in the family home rather than moving to a retirement community or assisted living facility. He helped with heavier maintenance tasks and appeared to understand my emotional attachment to the house, where his mother and I had been so happy together. But what I didn't realize was that Thomas had been experiencing serious financial difficulties that he had hidden from me. His small accounting practice was struggling. He had accumulated significant debt through poor business decisions, and he was facing potential bankruptcy that would destroy a professional reputation and financial future. Thomas had begun to view my house as a solution to his financial problems, seeing it as an asset that could be liquidated to provide him with the money he needed to save his business and pay off his debts. But he knew that I would never voluntarily sell the house or agree to help him financially to such an extent. Instead of asking for help directly or being honest about his financial situation, Thomas began researching ways to gain control of my assets without my knowledge or consent. He discovered that elderly people could be manipulated into making decisions that weren't in their best interests by people posing as authority figures, especially social workers and government officials. Thomas spent weeks researching the local social services system, learning about procedures for conducting home safety assessments and the criteria used to determine whether elderly people could continue living independently. He studied the language and processes used by legitimate social workers to make his planned deception as convincing as possible. He also researched hiring actors and discovered that there were people available for hire who specialized in portraying professional roles for various purposes. Thomas found a small theater company that was willing to provide actors who could convincingly portray social workers, complete with professional attire and believable performances. The actors Thomas hired were experienced in improvisational theater and were skilled at maintaining character during extended interactions. They were provided with detailed scripts and background information about social work procedures, and they rehearsed their roles thoroughly to ensure that their performances would be convincing and professional. Thomas also invested in creating fake identification badges, official-looking documents, and business cards that would support the actors' portrayal of legitimate social workers. He researched the actual Missouri Department of Social Services to ensure that his fake materials would appear authentic to someone unfamiliar with the real documents. The deception began on a Tuesday morning in September when two people who identified themselves as Patricia Williams and David Chun from Missouri Department of Social Services appeared at my front door with official-looking badges and clipboards. They explained that they were conducting routine safety assessments for elderly residents living alone and needed to inspect my home. Patricia appeared to be in her 30s, dressed professionally in a dark blue suit, carrying a leather portfolio filled with official-looking forms. David was a middle-aged man wearing a badge and carrying what appeared to be a tablet computer for recording assessment data. Both actors were polite, professional, and completely convincing in their portrayal of government social workers. They explained that their visit was part of a new program designed to ensure that elderly residents were living in safe conditions and had access to appropriate support services. They said that the assessment was mandatory and that failure to cooperate could result in legal action or forced relocation to institutional care. The actors spent over 2 hours in my home, carefully documenting what they claimed were safety violations and maintenance issues that posed risks to my health and well-being. They took photographs of minor problems like loose handrails, uneven steps, and outdated electrical outlets, presenting these normal maintenance issues as serious safety hazards. Patricia expressed particular concern about my ability to maintain such a large house at my age, suggesting that the physical demands of homeownership were becoming too challenging for someone in my 70s. She pointed out that I lived alone without immediate family nearby to assist with emergencies or daily needs. David documented what he claimed were code violations and structural problems that required immediate attention to ensure my safety. He explained that elderly people were particularly vulnerable to accidents in homes that weren't properly maintained, and that the state had a responsibility to ensure that I was living in appropriate conditions. At the end of their visit, Patricia and David informed me that their preliminary assessment had identified several serious concerns that needed to be addressed before they could approve my continued residence in the house. They said that I would need to relocate temporarily while the necessary repairs and improvements were completed. They presented me with official-looking documents that outlined the supposed violations and the requirements for correcting them. The paperwork appeared legitimate and included references to Missouri state codes and regulations that I had no way of verifying independently. The actors explained that the repair process would take several months and would require extensive work that would make the house uninhabitable during the renovation period. They said that the state would assist me in finding temporary housing that met safety standards while the work was being completed. When I expressed concern about the cost of the required repairs and my ability to afford temporary housing, Patricia assured me that there were assistance programs available to help elderly residents manage these expenses. She said that the state had partnerships with contractors and housing providers to ensure that the financial burden wouldn't be overwhelming. David provided me with a list of approved temporary housing options, including several assisted living facilities and rental apartments that he claimed met state standards for elderly residents. He strongly recommended a particular studio apartment complex that he said specialized in providing short-term housing for people in my situation. The pressure to make an immediate decision was intense, as the actors explained that delaying the relocation could result in legal action and forced removal from my home. They said that voluntary compliance would ensure that I had more control over the process and could choose my temporary housing arrangement. Faced with what appeared to be legitimate government authority and the threat of legal consequences, I felt that I had no choice but to comply with their demands. The actors had been convincing and professional, and their documentation appeared authentic and official. I agreed to relocate to the studio apartment that David had recommended, trusting that the social workers were acting in my best interests and that the temporary arrangement would allow me to return to my home once the required improvements were completed. The actors helped me contact the apartment complex and arrange for immediate occupancy of a furnished studio unit. They explained that this quick action was necessary to ensure my safety and to begin the repair process as soon as possible. Thomas appeared to be surprised and concerned when I told him about the social services visit and the requirement that I relocate temporarily. He offered to help me move and to oversee the repair work, positioning himself as a supportive son who wanted to ensure that everything was handled properly. But what I didn't know was that Thomas had arranged with the fake social workers to recommend the specific apartment complex because he had financial arrangements with the property management company. He was receiving kickbacks for referring tenants and was also benefiting from the inflated rent that I was paying for substandard housing. The studio apartment was small, cramped, and poorly maintained with outdated appliances, inadequate heating, and furniture that was worn and uncomfortable. The monthly rent was nearly 3 times what I had been paying for utilities in my own home, and the lease terms were unfavorable and restrictive. I was miserable in the tiny apartment, but I accepted the discomfort because I believed it was temporary and necessary for my safety. The actors had convinced me that returning to my home too quickly could result in legal problems, and that patience was required while the repairs were being completed. Thomas visited regularly and provided updates on the supposed repair work, always explaining that the project was more complex than originally anticipated and would require additional time to complete. He showed me fake invoices and progress reports that supported the illusion that legitimate work was being performed on my house. Meanwhile, Thomas was actually preparing my house for sale, making cosmetic improvements and staging it to attract buyers. He had forged power of attorney documents that gave him legal authority to act on my behalf, and he was working with a real estate agent to market the property. For 3 months, I lived in the cramped studio apartment, paying exorbitant rent and utilities, while believing that my home was being renovated to meet safety standards. I was isolated, depressed, and increasingly concerned about the timeline for returning to my familiar surroundings. The deception began to unravel when Mrs. Henderson, my longtime neighbor, called to ask about the for sale sign that had appeared in my front yard. She was confused because I had never mentioned plans to sell the house, and she wanted to make sure that everything was all right. When I told Mrs. Henderson that the house wasn't for sale and was only undergoing temporary repairs, she became concerned and offered to drive by the property to check on the progress. What she discovered was that there was no construction work taking place, but there was indeed a real estate sign advertising the house for sale. Mrs. Henderson immediately called me with this disturbing information, and I realized that something was seriously wrong with the situation. I contacted the phone number that Patricia Williams had given me for updates on the repair work, only to discover that the number was disconnected and had never been associated with any government agency. Further investigation revealed that there was no record of any safety assessment or repair orders for my property with the Missouri Department of Social Services. The legitimate agency had no knowledge of Patricia Williams, David Chun, or any program that matched what I had been told about mandatory safety evaluations. I discovered that Thomas had orchestrated the entire elaborate deception, hiring actors to portray social workers and creating fake documentation to trick me into leaving my home, so that he could sell it without my knowledge or consent. The sophisticated fraud had been designed to exploit my trust in authority figures and my fear of legal consequences. The betrayal was devastating and complete. Not only had Thomas stolen my home and financial security, but he had also shattered my trust in institutions and people who I had believed were there to protect me. The elaborate nature of the deception showed a level of planning and callousness that I couldn't reconcile with the son I thought I knew. When I confronted Thomas about the fraud, he initially tried to maintain the deception, claiming that there had been miscommunications and that the sale of the house was necessary to pay for the required repairs. But when faced with evidence of his criminal behavior, he eventually admitted to orchestrating the entire scheme. Thomas showed no remorse for his actions and seemed to view the fraud as a justified response to his financial problems. He argued that he would eventually inherit the house anyway and that he had simply accelerated the timeline to address his immediate needs. I immediately contacted law enforcement and reported Thomas for fraud, forgery, and elder abuse. The investigation revealed the full extent of his criminal enterprise, including the hired actors, forged documents, and kickback arrangements with the apartment complex. The legal consequences for Thomas were severe, including criminal charges for multiple felonies and civil liability for the financial damages he had caused. The actors who had participated in the fraud were also charged with conspiracy and fraud for their roles in the elaborate deception. But something unexpected happened during the legal proceedings that would restore my faith in human decency and provide hope for rebuilding my life. Detective Sarah Rodriguez, who was investigating my case, had been working on several similar scams targeting elderly people and had developed expertise in elder fraud prevention. Detective Rodriguez connected me with a nonprofit organization called Elder Justice Advocates that specialize in helping elderly victims of financial fraud recover from their losses and rebuild their lives. The organization provided both legal assistance and emotional support for people who had been victimized by family members. Through Elder Justice Advocates, I was able to recover my house and most of my financial losses, though the emotional damage from Thomas's betrayal was more difficult to repair. The organization also helped me connect with other elderly people who had experienced similar frauds, providing a support network of people who understood the unique pain of being victimized by family members. More importantly, the organization invited me to become an advocate for elder fraud prevention, sharing my story to help other elderly people recognize and avoid similar scams. My experience became part of educational programs designed to help seniors protect themselves from sophisticated frauds that exploit their trust and vulnerability. Working with elder justice advocates gave me a sense of purpose and healing that helped me process the trauma of Thomas's betrayal, while also protecting other elderly people from similar exploitation. My story has been used to train law enforcement officers, social workers, and healthcare providers about the warning signs of elder fraud. Today, more than a year after discovering Thomas's fraud, I'm back in my own home and working to rebuild my life and my ability to trust other people. While my relationship with Thomas is permanently severed, I've found meaning in using my experience to help protect other elderly people from similar victimization. The experience taught me that even the most sophisticated frauds can be defeated when victims have access to knowledgeable advocates and when law enforcement takes elder abuse seriously. It also showed me that recovery is possible even from the most devastating betrayals when we find purpose in helping others avoid similar harm. That's my story. How my son hired actors to pose as social workers and steal my home through an elaborate theatrical fraud, but how dedicated advocates helped me recover my property and find purpose in protecting other elderly people. Sometimes the worst betrayals can become opportunities to make a positive difference in the world and to rebuild our lives with stronger foundations.